Okay, well, it's a true pleasure to begin this important week with a keynote lecture that perfectly sets the tone for what lies ahead. We could not have imagined a better way to open our program than with the presence of Professor Maude Gonne from the University of Liège. She is currently director of the Interdisciplinary Research Center for Translation and Interpretation and board member of the Center for Translation Studies in Leuven, CIRTI. Professor Gonne is a leading voice in the study of cultural transfer, intercultural dialogue, and the theoretical frameworks that help us understand how cultures emerge and interact. And her work is both intellectually rigorous and profoundly relevant to the challenges and opportunities of our interconnected world. She has authored a lot of articles, as well as the monograph Contrebande littéraire et culturelle à la Belle Époque. She co-edited Transfer Thinking and Translation Studies, Paradoxes of Misunderstandings in Cultural Transfers, and the last one, The Complexity of Social Cultural Emergence. So today she will share her insights in a lecture entitled Interconnectedness and Cultural Emergence, the theoretical and practical implications of studying cultural transfers. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Maude Gonne.
Thank you very much, Frederic, for these nice words. I would like to thank the organizing committee, and in particular Frederic, for the honor of inviting me to this second edition of the Blended Intensive Program, Connecting Culture, Sustainability, Travel, Translation and Migration, which brings all of you today around a key dimension of contemporary research in the humanities, that is connectivity or connectedness. That's not exactly the same. Connectivity would be the ability to connect, and it's mostly associated with technology, while connectedness would be the state of being connected and having a close relationships with things or people. Anyway, humans have always connected. That might even be one of the key factors of the humanity. And we can say that in spite of a so-called hyper-connected world, the need for connection is becoming increasingly acute. And not only a need for inter-human connection, but also connection with the local, with nature, and with spirituality. However, one might say that despite this natural inclination to connect, the way our society is structured does not reflect this need. Fields of study, disciplines, academic curricula, cultures, and many more tend also to be disconnected from one another. Universities and publication channels are organized according to disciplines. The same for funding and promotions. And reputations are built within fields of study. As a result, interdisciplinary work is not so easy to conduct and also not so easy to teach in traditional settings. And this particular blended program is precisely the setting where it is possible to conduct such research, to make connection. But as you know, it's also a bit exceptional. It's the first time I heard about the BIT programs, and I'm very pleased to be part of it. But in general, mixing things up is not well seen. But as you understand in this presentation, I'm going to do the opposite. I will tell you, look for links for connections, mix things up, or rather put them in relation to each other. I indeed believe, just as Frédéric said, that to answer the big questions, so the questions of sustainability, be they social, ecological, political, linguistic, and so on, we need mixed answers. At this point in time, we know enough about the nature of problems to be able to claim that problems can never be solved from one perspective only. Connection between fields, scholars, students, university, as it is the case here, is crucial. So enjoy. According to Bruno Latour, in We Have Never Been Modern, in 1993, the phenomenon of disconnection comes from the so-called Great Divide. In short parenthesis, before going into more details, Bruno Latour was born in 1947 and died 3 years ago. He was a French anthropologist slash philosopher slash sociologist who worked at the École des Mines and Sciences Po in Paris, and was, according to the New York Times in 2018, I quote, France's most famous and misunderstood philosopher. I close the parenthesis. So, for Bruno Latour, the world is made up of hybrid objects, or actors that are constantly proliferating and that pertain to multiple domains. The political, the literary, the economic, the technical, the scientific, the religious, and so on. Take the COVID pandemic, for instance, or ChatGPT, or global warming. Or can we understand these strange objects, or we can speak of hyper-objects, that invade the world? Do they belong to nature? Do they belong to culture? According to him, so in 1993, the modern critical discourse fails to account for the hybrid nature of these objects and prefers to split and separate them, to oppose them, thereby making, among other things, the distinction between human and non-human, between microstructure and macrostructure, between context and content, and more generally between nature and culture. This is thus what Bruno Latour calls the Great Divide, which opposes and fixes objects instead of associating them and recognizing their heterogeneity. In this context, the objective of Latour is to reconnect the social and natural worlds by arguing that the modernist distinction between nature and culture never existed. Consequently, we have never been modern. Michel Serres is another philosopher slash anthropologist slash thinker, but also a mathematician, who share Latour's opinion and focus in particular on the separation between the humanities and social science from the exact science. He studied at the Sorbonne, at Stanford, Johns Hopkins, and he also has a strange, amusing reception since on the back cover of Conversation on Science, Culture and Time in '92, which is in fact a fascinating book reproducing an interview of Michel Serres by Bruno Latour, we can read, I quote, "Although elected to the prestigious French Academy in 1990, Michel Serres has long been considered as a maverick, a provocative thinker whose prolific writings on culture, science, and philosophy have often baffled more than they have enlightened." So I'm presenting two strange thinkers to you. So with his identity as both a philosopher and a mathematician, he has long been indignant about the lack of connection between the humanities and the so-called exact science. I quote from Éclaircissement, translation. Comment se fait-il que les sciences humaines ou sociales ne parlaient jamais du monde, comme si les groupes étaient suspendus dans le vide? Comment se fait-il que les sciences dites dures fassent l'impasse sur les hommes? So, at the point of departure, Michel Serres takes a stand against positivism, accused of reducing the complexity of the social to fixed category, to cut a little part with no view on walls. Here is a simple example that he gives a car. I will read in French. You can follow. Une voiture automobile parcourt l'espace. Donc voilà pour la nature. Et concourt à la vanité de son propriétaire. Voilà pour la culture, certes. Mis ensemble, ces deux véhicules, qui n'en font qu'un, bien sûr, nous permettent, en fin de semaine, aux belles vacances, d'assouvir notre soif inextinguible de sacrifices humains, ceux que nous offrons aux dates exactes et solennelles de fête, à des dieux que nous croyions avoir oubliés. Machines, objets techniques qui accentuent notre maîtrise de l'étendue, qui règle quelques rapports de groupe ou de psychologie visqueuse, mais descend soudain, par ce coup de sonde, dans les fonds d'une anthropologie formidable. Vous voyez comment on passe sans césure de la science, ici la thermodynamique et la résistance des matériaux, à la technique, et de celle-ci à la sociologie, puis à l'histoire des religions. Here also, the objective of Michel Serres is to reconnect nature and culture, humanities and science, and thus to provide a broader view on the reality as well as new perspectives on the biggest challenge of all times. As Michel Serres states, I quote, "To face global danger, we need a global philosophy." We can thus say that both Latour and Michel Serres are searching patterns that connect, and you might be aware that both of them found their model in translation. With other words, both thinkers have designed a certain translational model to fight against disconnection. And this will be the next part of my presentation. Here a look at my structure. So we already did the introduction entitled Connection and Disconnection, the Great Divide. Now I would like to present approaches of the sociology of knowledge, that is the study of science as a social practice, highlighting especially the works of Michel Serres and Bruno Latour. In a second part, I will arrive at the issue of transfers. I will discuss the question of translation as transfer or transfer as translation, and develop a certain transfer thinking in translation studies, distinguishing the following transfer natures. You can see it here, but I will distinguish non-linearity and entanglements, and then transmediality and chains of transfers. After that, translator and mediators, and finally, emergence and transformation. And for each feature, I will try to give practical example on how this can apply to a research project or a research object. And finally, I am going to conclude. I hope I will be on time, but if not, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I will stop when you tell me. Oh, give me 2 minutes. So, connection and translation, the sociology of knowledge. Michel Serres and Bruno Latour, but also various interdisciplinary thinkers at the crossroad of sociology, anthropology, philosophy, such as Michel Caillon, Cobus Marais, or Michael Cronin, have explicitly extended a certain translational model to fields of knowledge beyond the textual one, thereby participating in broadening the concept of linguistic translation into an intersemiotic, all-encompassing epistemologic tool and ontological concept. That's a big name. For not so much, I will explain. For Michel Serres, knowledge is produced by interference and translation between domains, disciplines, and theories. In La Traduction, published in 1972, he argues, the more one moves toward invention, the more one encounters exchange and translation. But what is translation for Michel Serres? In fact, that is something close to comparatism. It is a kind of demonstration. Don't forget, he's a mathematician, and a philosopher, but first a mathematician. And he calls that structural analysis. It is through comparison that Serre's translation highlights invariant structure emerging from set of groups whose proximity was previously unknown. For example, he will translate La Fontaine, L'Agneau et le Loup into mathematics, making geometry and the fable interfere to highlight an invariant structure. I will come back on this invariant structure. Through analogy, because for him it's the only way to produce knowledge, new knowledge is analogy. He identifies similar structures in different domains. For example, the same, well, I've tried to understand the demonstration he made, but it's very complex, and it's something that makes him particularly interesting. I will come on that later, but as is between a mathematician and philosopher, he hasn't find a common language to speak to both. So, or he give a very poetical language to explain a demonstration, and I can understand, or he give a mathematician demonstration to explain a poetry, for example, of Rimbaud, and I'm a bit lost. So that is somebody who occupies a very strange position, and that makes that most of people think he's a bit crazy, but at the same time, he was at the French Academy, and he's a very, very renowned researcher or philosopher. Parenthesis close. Yeah, that's just what I said. So, I have tried, he said, j'ai tenté de lancer des liaisons là où il n'y avait que des coupures. Et la tentative supposait un prix à payer très élevé. As I said, the price to pay is just not to be read or to be considered as a crazy people. Ne pas être entendu, puisqu'il n'existait pas de langue commune de part et d'autre de la coupure. Dans un dialogue, on écoute un interlocuteur, mais jamais l'interprète. J'ai accepté de jouer ce jeu et d'en payer chèrement les conditions et obligations. Oui. So, now in Reassembling the Social, an introduction to actor network theory, that's 2005, Latour goes further in the translational model of Michel Serres. For Latour, translation is a process. It is, I quote, a connection that transports, so to speak, transformations. The actor network theory, or sociologie de la traduction, was not specifically designed to provide an account of cultural exchange. Actor network theory, or ANT, aims in particular to offer a flexible and empirical methodological framework while at the same time bringing unexpected hybrid actors and roles into view. Indeed, ANT is concerned with what happens between things. It therefore focuses on the process of production rather than on the finished product, on hybridity rather than homogeneous category, agency rather than social determination, and the dynamics of transformation rather than those of reproduction. In fact, he explicitly opposes Pierre Bourdieu's work. For Latour, what we call the social does not explain anything. Thus, the traditional sociology does not explain anything, but it's rather the inverse. It is a phenomenon that requires explanation. In other words, there is no encompassing social order that can provide an explanation on, for the world, so political explanation, economy, religion, a sociological explanation of the economy, of the politics, of the religion. But instead, what we perceive as the social is an unpredictable process of association between hybrid elements or actors who pertains to the politics, the economy, the religion, and so on. And it is what needs to be explained. Seen from this angle, ANT is an empirical method, a tool for analyzing the social. It necessarily begins out of chaos by identifying the actors, human and non-humans, of the action, and by taking into account their interest, stakes, calculations, and degrees of convergence. Thus, the method seeks to follow the actors, and the actors is not necessarily humans, it can be objects, it can be discourses, it can be a bit everything, what makes it also a very complex but interesting and flexible method. So the network is a concept, it's not a thing out there, it is a tool to help describe something, not what is being described. That means that what he proposed is to follow the actors, to trace connection between the actors, and by tracing those relationships between actors emerge a kind of networks, but the network is not something that you can explain, that's something that's something explaining, not something that has to be explained. Latour recommends treating all actors as mediators who, I quote, translate and distort what they are meant to convey. No matter how apparently simple a mediator may look, it may become complex. It may lead in multiple directions, which will modify all the contradictory accounts attributed to its role. To sum up, ANT is a scientific method that refuses to reduce the social to predefined analytical framework. It seeks instead to work with frameworks that are unstable. Only by following actors, by letting them speak and not speak in their place, and by observing their association, can we reassemble the social. At this point, we might be wondering why these philosophers, Bruno Latour and Michel Serres, why they choose the concept of translation to frame their sociology of scientific knowledge. In his stimulating account of the epistemological use of translation, Bernard Smet, who was a PhD student at the University of Liège, recognizes a similar opacity in knowledge production and in interlingual translation process. This opacity refers to the subjective and unpredictable part of the translator's choice between multiple options. Like the production of knowledge, translation can be understood as an opaque process with unpredictable output. And for Smet, what is gained in translation, since in translation something is gained and something is lost, at least is what we say, for him, what is gained in translation is the production of an invariance. That is, what constitutes it essentially as a certain meaning, a certain form, a certain intention that you can and when you translate, you preserve everything changed, the language changed, the form, the structures changed, but the language structure changed, but there is something that is conserved. What it is, that is the invariant. This and it might be different for different translator. This allows us to better understand the importation of translation into the sociology of knowledge. What is gained in translation would be the comprehension of what is in a certain way conserved across through a transformative process. The invariant does not predate the translator's decision or the sociological analysis, but is constructed and selected alongside the translation or the knowledge process. So as Michel Serres argues, it is possible that science is the set of messages that are optimally invariant across every translation strategy. Now the second part, the theoretical and practical implication of studying cultural transfers. So long after the concept of translation was established in the sociology of knowledge, so long after Michel Serres or Bruno Latour, translation study seems to be living in a paradigm shift. As a response to the proliferation of multimodal and hyper-objects, massively distributed in time and space, and dethroning the text and especially the literary text as the primary product of translation, new trends in translation studies emerge to redefine the specificity of translation as a complex process, an unpredictable process rather than a product, connecting much more than text, going beyond the linguistic bias and overtaking the source and target binaries. From an eco-translational point of view, take Michael Cronin, or a biosemiotic point of view, take Comus Marais, translation becomes an all-encompassing concept to think the interconnectedness of all human and non-human activity and to apprehend the emergence of social-cultural phenomena. Therefore, Michael Cronin uses the term tradosphere to refer to all translation systems on the planet, all the way in which information circulates between living and non-living organisms and is translated into a language or a code that can be processed or understood by the receiving entity. So what does this mean is that, in fact, you can find translation everywhere. In the transformation of a book into a movie, for instance, or in the transformation of indigenous oppression into monuments, in the transformation and diffusion of news in the press, or as in this example, the transformation of La Gesta Danorum from the 13th century into a Shakespearean tragedy around 1600, into a romantic painting in the 19th century, and into Rimbaud's poem Ophélie. While this new translation studies approach gives testimony to a significant change in paradigm, they have, you understand it, have criticized also, first of all, if everything is a translation, nothing is a translation anymore. This is precisely what Andrew Chesterman refers to in 2020, I quote, "If one can see anything as translation or the result of translation, parks, churches, government, organization, and so on, does the concept retain any meaning? Does metaphorization have no limits?" As Michael Cronin asks in 2020, not everything is a translation, but a great many things have a translational dimension and can be better understood if this dimension is taken into account. This new translation studies approach are also criticized for other reasons, among others for their limited operational and explanatory power. You might have experimented that in other speech until now. However, these approaches must be taken for what they are, a meta-theory or a philosophy of translation. They do not pretend to offer ready-made methods to explore the translation worlds they are opening. Now, when it comes to switching to cultural transfer, I think there is a tension that needs to be spelled out from the outset. What is the relationship between translation and transfer? How do they relate to each other? Is transfer framing within translation, or is translation a type of transfer? Because on the one hand, I have just explained that translation is used in the sociology of knowledge as an epistemological framework and as a method. On the other hand, I just told you that the broadening of the concept of translation in translation studies constitutes the emergence of a new paradigm. So where are the transfers in this landscape? In its current acceptation, the concept of transfer is at the same time an object of study, thus the complex movement of text, objects, and people across borders, but also a method or a research program that wants to go beyond comparatism and look at intersection in cultural history. In polysystem theory, transfer appears also in the 1919 as a crucial aspect of cultural or literary system survival and maintenance. Itamar Evenzoar defined transfer as a process whereby imported goods are integrated into a home repertoire and the consequences generated by this integration. For the Israeli scholar, translation proper is only one of several different types of movement that can be observed between and within cultural systems. He calls thus upon translation study scholars to move toward a transfer theory. So that is in 1990. He says, our accumulated knowledge about translation indicates more and more that translational procedures between two systems are in principle analogous, even homologous, with transfers within the borders of the system. The hypothesis of analogy-homology has been formulated before, notably by Jacobson. But no consequences have even been drawn for translation theory. Shall we go on ignoring this hypothesis, or would it be not wiser to acknowledge this, the implicit practice whereby translation is discussed in terms of transfers and vice versa? In other words, would it not be profitable to think and work explicitly rather than implicitly in terms of a transfer theory? Sooner or later, I believe it will turn out to be uneconomical to deal with transfer and translation separately. Since then, the concept has been regularly used and adapted in translation studies research. So, transfer or translation? I don't really know. I have the impression that it's mainly a terminological and a disciplinary issue. Science isn't linear, as we know, which ultimately also means that various similar concepts are competing in various disciplines. Since its emergence in the 1980 in the framework of Franco-German intercultural history, so you know, with Michael Werner, Michel Espagne, and later Zimmermann, the notion of cultural transfer has spread without any real terminological consensus in different research fields of the humanities, including literary studies, cultural history, policy studies, and translation studies. It has penetrated the field of policy systems, who may transfer broader concepts than translation. Then in the 2010, Susan Gopferich and Lievendulst responded explicitly to Evenzoar's call in the direction of a transfer theory for Gopferich and the concept of assumed transfer for Lievendulst. And then, in the years that followed, we had Coppice Marais, Michael Konin, and others proposing to broaden the field of translation, making it broader than linguistic transfer, just as Evenzoar wanted to do, in fact, but with the term of transfer. So, in any case, I think all this shows the vitality of the translation studies discipline, but also means that I'm not quite sure where I stand at the moment, which in itself it's not too bad either. But many empirical studies on mediator or networks have demonstrated the operationality of the concept of transfers to describe the complex circulation of cultural goods and text across borders. So in sum, transfer has played and still plays an important role in opening up the field of translation studies. Okay. Perfect. Is everything clear until now? I'm glad. To sum up, and even if consensus is lacking, the concept of transfer is used as a tool to study a large array of multidirectional movement of text, ideas, objects, people, knowledge, images, and so on, and seem to always induce a dynamic of transformation and mediation, and to account for a certain materiality that researchers can retrace from the past. In what follows, I have compiled with Reine Meelaerts a series of features to think transfers in translation studies. In this context, and beyond in fact, in this context, transfer becomes an umbrella concept referring to the multidirectional and transformative process of exchange, verbal and non-verbal, between and within cultures, and requiring the presence of a mediator. It can also be seen as an attempt to unify various intersemiotic, interlingual translational in order to better embrace the complexity of intercultural process. These features are, the first one, non-linearity and entanglement. Traditionally, translation studies links translation to at least the existence of one specific source text and the transfer of some element of the source text into a target text, the translation. While this kind of conceptualization has the advantage of being simple and straightforward, it often leads to an oversimplification of what translation as a product and transfer as a process really entails. But we have also to say that multidirectional transfer relationships are difficult to reconstruct. They vary in shape and content and keep a loose bond with their source. I'm quoting Levenhulst. Translation scholar Hélène Buzelin pointed out the actor network theory as a tool that can account not only for the many diverse actors involved in the translation or transfer process. It means authors, translators, editors, correctors, but also simultaneously for an heterogeneous set of entities, version, drafts, book markets, remuneration contracts, and so on, that exert their influence across the entire process. She demonstrated that following actors could generate a description of translation in the making, in which the context emerged as the translation project along with a process. This transfer can be described as a historical process from which the final state cannot be deduced. The change in quality and direction run continuously or discontinuously, accelerated and abruptly, gradually died off or last forever. And that's a bit the problem, is that the transfer can only be traced afterwards, a posteriori. Is the reason why Hélène Buzelin proposed to make this actor network functioning, to reconstruct, to trace back a process, and that's something I've tried to do for my PhD, during my PhD, so I will give a little example here. An analysis of the correspondence between Georges Eekhout, which is a Flemish novelist known for his Flemish in Belgium. So in Belgium we have, do you know the Belgium context? Bilingual context, Dutch and French, and on the north it's called Flemish, and on the south Walloon. So it's so I discover in the correspondences a surprising fact. Georges Eekhout, which is a known writer, contributed under the pseudonym of Gabriel Destranges and in collaboration with Julius Hoss to the writing of a popular novel at the turn of the 20th century called Le Chanteur de Rue Bruxellois. The novel's message is a Flemish patriotic one. It glorifies, through the medium of an essentialist discourse, a Flemish, not Belgium, but linguistic and patriotic identity. And yet, the novel is bilingual. It was also published weekly in Brussels in Flemish, the Brusselse Straatzanger. Moreover, it turns out to be an adaptation of a Flemish novel from 1992, which in turn is itself an adaptation of a play by the same author in 1982. So the writing, translation, and weekly publication of this novel does clearly represent an intranational transfer activity. But an examination of the archive shows that Host hired someone by the name of Jan Breulans to extend the writing of Le Chanteur de Rue Bruxellois. The agreement stipulates that only Julius Host's name will appear in the publication. It does not mention the name Gabriel Destranges in the contract or the existence of a French version. Thus, Jan Breulans' statue, like Eekhout's statue, was that of a ghostwriter, given the task of writing anonymously or of translating a text to be published under someone else's name. What is interesting is that this collaborative, less prestigious production later lands in Georges Ecaud's official production published in Paris. So he wrote a few words in his diary to avoid being accused of plagiarism. I let nobody try later to accuse me of plagiarism, the anonymous author of all these farragos edited by my friend Os. This anonymous author was me. Okay, so that was entanglement. I think you see why. Now, transmediality and chain of interconnected transfer technique. Translation study has traditionally focused on interlingual translation at the expense of intra- and intersemiotic translational relationship. Written material has been privileged over oral production. However, translation proper never stands on its own and cannot always be distinguished from related practice. I quote Lievenduls et al. It is hardly feasible to make clear boundaries between translating and other writing practices. To start with, the very act of translating includes form of non-translating, such as borrowing, adaptation, rewriting, and so on. So when reconstructing complex transfer chains, transfer techniques and media overlap and alternate constantly. Borrowing, copying, adapting, rewriting, translating, plagiarism, multilingual writing. As an umbrella concept, transfer should be able to account for the variety of modalities and the interconnectedness of the different techniques through which information, knowledge, and ideas flows. As an example, there is a trentenaire. It's the 22 phenomenon in Wallonia. Basically, it's the first Walloon soap. Unless you make a research in the newspaper, where it's not hidden, it's not made clear that this is in fact an adaptation of a Flemish series called Dertigers that started in 2019 already. It's all the more amusing given that the transfer is not just linguistic, it's also geographical and social, since the scenario of Dertigers which take place in Antwerp, a cosmopolitan and fairly wealthy city, is transposed to Charleroi in a Trentenaire, one of the poorest cities in Wallonia and one with a bad reputation. We have here thus several levels of transfer and a mixture of adaptation, creation of a brand new scenario and faithful translation. When you dig a little deeper, you realize also that Dertiger is itself adapted to the Netherlands from 22 already. So it's an intra-linguistic translation, because Flemish, well, it's not a language, Dutch would be the official language, which is shared with the Netherlands. So it's an intralinguistic translation that demonstrates the success of this transfer and this fantastic story. That's really a soap. That's fine. Now, translator, from translator to mediators. More often than not, translation is just one part of a mediator's activity, and in some cases, it may even be entirely absent. We all know that an author may interact with the translator of their work, that author may write about translators and vice versa, or that translator may turn into author. We also know that author may become self-translator or write in two languages. And we know how dynamic the relations are between writing and translating in the world of multimedia. So when we speak of a mediator, we are referring to a multiplicity of roles and the intermediary role played by such actors. As an example from a totally other domain with very different power dynamic at stage, I will take Joséphine Bacon. Joséphine Bacon is born in 1947. She is in the Innu community of Pessamit in Quebec. She is an Innu poet, lyricist, storyteller, lecturer, screenwriter, translator, interpreter, and filmmaker. For the first 5 years of her life, she lived as a semi-nomad. She was then sent to a residential school near Sept-Îles, and we know, following the 2015 report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, that these pensionnats were institutions designed to educate, evangelize, and above all, assimilate indigenous children. So as an adult, Joséphine Bacon says that she wants to, I quote, faire œuvre de passeuse in order to let see, let hear her Innu culture in a variety of ways. In particular, she practices self-translation, each text presenting a mirror image of the Innu version and the French version. It is clear that to isolate translation activity or the translation role in her case would be quite illusory and reductive. Now, the last feature of this transfer thinking in translation studies would be emergence and transformation. According to Espagne and Werner, but also Even Zohar later, transfer induces transformation. The notion of emergence that comes from complexity theory refers to the process through which a system or organization emerges out of the interaction of its parts. In this system of organization, the whole is typically more than the sum of its parts, but at the same time, each separate part cannot be fused or confused with the whole. The product of transfer can be conceptualized as an emergent phenomenon, resulting from the interaction between its parts and creating something new, which at the same time is similar to its source. As an example, I want to go back to the first example from my PhD thesis, because also to show you that I believe that transformation, when we speak about transformation, it can only be revealed through a really translational analysis, textual or multimodal analysis. And it's important to make this analysis too, if you have time, because you can see that this last part of the analysis can contradict the other transfer directions, for instance. In fact, Anthony Pym says that it is often translation that first constitutes a border, a source on one side, a target on the other. The transformation that occur as part of the mediating process can reinforce but also contradict the given purpose of a transfer. So how did Georges Descodes handle the transmission in French of an essentialist message about Flemish identity, as I told you? The availability for part of the process of a tertium comparationist, you remember there was also a novel from which it was an adaptation, makes it possible to discern some of the transformation operated by Descodes in the course of the patriotic message back and forth journey. I will choose only one example here. In the excerpt, the Flemish race, at that time that was a common concept, in Descodes' version, which is the second one, is no longer Klucker. Here is the original. Dat ze even een Klucker has dan het Spaanse afstand. So the Flemish race is no longer more courageous, stronger than the Spanish race, but is simply characterized by distinctive features. This added nuance is taken up by Bruylants in the Dutch version. So we can come on that later if it was not clear, but in reality I should take 20 minutes just for this. So I will go to the conclusion, if it's okay. Transfer thinking in translation studies is a plea in favor of working with uncertainties. As Cobus-Marais points out, scholarly thought needs to be able to live with disorder, complexity, paradox, or, as Latour suggests, it should follow reality like an ant, and you see ant is also ANT, actor network theory, through all the particular complex labyrinths to and through which it leads. But transfer as a concept and a tool does not escape criticism. To start with, the poor metaphorical potential as underlined by Chesterman in 2020. Etymologically, transfer means to carry over, which implicitly refers to invariance and to an unilateral movement at the opposite of the idea of entanglement. But if you follow me since the beginning, you see that invariance can also be a force of transfer, because it can be the transfer of invariance, but through transformation. And it is true that in economics, for instance, transfer refers to a one-way payment to an entity. In psychology, transference, transfer in French, is the unidirectional process of projecting one's feeling into someone else. In times of COVID-19, medical transfer implies cooperation across borders in order to move patients from one hospital to a less overwhelmed one. In football, the players goes for transfer, the players goes to another club but remain the same. And I quote Chesterman, one would not expect this player to arrive in this new team in some altered state, but to be precisely the same skilled player that he had been in his previous team, end of quote. But even in this context, can we really assume that these transferred entities do not leave anything at their starting point and that they have not transformed by the journey to another destination? Let's take the football player example. We could suggest that besides a lot of money, the football player did not only leave an empty position behind, but also some expertise and prestige in the club he or she departed from. And even if the receiving club expects the transferred player to preserve the same or better skills, this cannot guarantee that the change of sportive, cultural, linguistic, familiar environment will not immediately alter the player's psychological state and football proficiency. Finally, the 21st century digital revolution and climatic crisis urges us to rethink translation studies in terms of process and in terms of connectivity, rather than in terms of product or duplication. First, in the digital world, objects are constantly copied, changed, translated, and moved around in an unpredictable dynamic in which source and target distinctions appears to be illusory. Through a continuous process of refreshing and updating, sources are more fragile and unstable than ever. Reflection on the sustainability of access to digital knowledge in a context of rapid technological innovation should include transfer thinking. Second, and I will finish with that, how to address the exponential growth of hyperobjects. They can no longer be grasped as objects if we do not think in connection, if we do not look at artifacts and nature in the same way, if we do not view ourselves as being part of the picture. As Michael Gonne puts it, and it will be my final quote, it is no longer possible to speak about the environment as something out there, as a negligible and dispensable externality. The environment is not exterior to, but constitutive of who we are. Secondly, it is no longer tenable to conceive of humans as a species apart, but as one species among many in relationship of increasingly acute interdependency. Therefore, we must think again about what is to be human, and if we think again about what is to be human, then we must inevitably think again about one of the activities that humans engage in, namely translation. Thank you.